to revisit regulatory proposals. And I'll turn it over to Mr. Keith, I believe, at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this point in the agenda is the opportunity to review the regulatory proposals and gather any additional information you require before making decisions about them. We will ask you to make decisions about them starting this afternoon. So after you've gotten your recommendations from Conference Board and Processor Advisory Board, this afternoon, one item that we'll ask you to make decisions on will be regulatory proposals. And most of them you can act on this afternoon. Clearly the fishery limits will have to wait till tomorrow morning. But most of the rest of them you can probably clear off the deck this afternoon. And so once again, there are 5 proposals from the Secretariat. The A proposals, A1 is the fishery limits. This is the one that you will fill in tomorrow when you make your TCEY decisions. And again, the only structural change to this regulation is to add the table of TCEY limits to the fishery regulations directly. In the past, that has not actually been included there, and that's the editorial change that takes place with this one, and the rest of it is you're filling in the boxes as you make decisions tomorrow morning. So are there any questions about proposal A1, how it works or what it does? And we can also put the text of the proposal itself on the screen if that's helpful to you. Yeah, so can I do that? Yeah. So in the appendix is the suggested regulatory language. This is what we would insert into the fishery limits. And the part that is new is table 1, the TCEY limits. And then the part which is as it has been before in the fishery regulations is the table which describes the various sector allocations that all result from the various catch sharing arrangements in place by the contracting parties.
So the proposal is to include the top portion and the second portion, correct?
Through the chair, Commissioner Ellison, that's correct. The second table is what's in the regulations now, and we're adding the first table, and the object of that is to make clear what the actual limit decisions are that you make on an annual basis, and then how those relate to the sector allocations which follow.
Any further questions on or clarifications on this? I'm good with it.
All right, thank you. If we could have the text for proposal A2 then. So the second proposal is the fishing periods. What the proposal does is document, of course, the decisions you make about fishing periods every year. Structurally, it actually reorganizes the regulation itself so that it starts with the overall fishing periods. Let me get down there to it.
Yeah, Neil.
Sorry, this is a little bit late. We just had one small observation on the limits piece. Can I go back to the first one for a moment?
Back to the first one, just could we have the proposal A1 back on the screen, please?
Bad form, I know.
Not to worry.
Can you make sure your mic's on, Neil? I couldn't.
The first sentence above the table refers to mortality values. I'm not sure why we use the term values there. instead of limits, which is the title for the actual table just above.
Right. Through the chair, Commissioner Davis, good eye, thank you. And actually, I should have pointed that out. In our meeting with our agency partners yesterday, we actually went through the text of the fishery regulations and we discovered that as well. That should be limits there in that place. And so they're described as limits. And there's another place farther down where the word values will be replaced by limits. Okay, back to A2 then, please. All right, so what this one does is at the top, it has paragraphs 2 and 3, which are the period for commercial fishing throughout the convention area. So in all regulatory areas, all commercial directed fishing for Pacific halibut takes place between the date you select and ends at the date you select. And both of your subsidiary bodies will have recommendations for you as to what those dates should be.
That seems pretty straightforward. We just
Yes.
fill in the blank.
Yes, sir. The one question that I did have about this is we always recommend that the dates be fixed, so they're the same from year to year, and each year you have chosen new dates. So all that happens here is you select the dates, and that's what goes in there, and they're the dates until they're changed, which could be next year or could be never. And then the second part is the two options for the non-tribal directed commercial halibut, Pacific halibut fishery in IPHC regulatory area 2A. Both options are longer than the current 10-hour derby that we have been using. The first option is for a 2-day fishing period and the second is for a 3-day fishing period. And I believe both of the subsidiary bodies will have a recommendation for you on this particular one. We noted that the Pacific Fishery Management Council recommended to you the 3-day option and that it should start on Monday, which would be the 4th Monday of June. Yes, Paul.
Yeah, thank you. I thought we were going to approve or not as we went through these. Did I miss something?
Through the chair, Commissioner Ryall, we'll ask you to take action on them this afternoon after you've had your recommendations from the subsidiary bodies. So this point is...
So we'll still get some input on these regulations from the subsidiary bodies this afternoon?
Yes, sir. That's
Okay,
correct.
thanks.
So
We have, I believe, an hour and 15 minutes at the final section of the day to actually take action on these, recognizing there may be one we can't take action on until tomorrow.
that's exactly right. So the point of this morning is to make sure that you have all of your questions answered, and we've provided you all the information you need from our point of view and from the agencies if you have questions of their representatives as well. And so that's what A2 is. The first part is the overall commercial dates for the whole coast, and the second part is the specific dates for the non-tribal directed fishery in IPHC regulatory area 2A. Any other questions about proposal A2?
So the June 24th, is that the Pacific Council's recommendation?
Through the chair, Commissioner Alverson, the way the text on the screen is the proposal that's been published that we wrote, and the 24th is actually a Wednesday. So the recommendation from the Pacific Council would be that it start on the 4th Monday of June, which is the 22nd. And so your action could be to adopt this with the 3-day option with the fishing period beginning on the 4th Monday of June. You could tell us that.
Through the chair, and if I could just add, excuse me, I'm coming down with a cold, that the Secretariat also has no problem with that suggested revision of starting on the Monday. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Wilson. We're quite happy with a Monday start.
I guess you could, unless there are questions on this, go ahead.
All right.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry, Mr. Hours.
So if we say 3 days, we got different hour closings. Is that 72 hours? Is that, what's the proper thing to say, to make a motion? 24 times 3 is 72, but we got an 8, would be 6 o'clock in the evening closure and an 8 o'clock in opening. So we need to define those up front so we don't have some confusion, 8 to 8 or.
Through the chair, Commissioner Alverson. Yes, sir. This is the times that the 10-hour derby uses right now are from 8 to 1800. And we've chosen the same start time, 08, and same closing times, 1800. So there's 3 fishing days. It's actually 58 hours in duration. And the wording for how you adopt it will make it clear that you're choosing this option. You adopt this regulation, or you adopt this regulatory proposal that includes this language, which includes the opening and closing times.
I don't want to be a bother on this, but I want to make it right in my mind because of the regular, I don't want to get someone in trouble with law enforcement.
Through the chair, Commissioner Alverson, I will note that there was extensive discussion on this particular question at the the Pacific Fishery Management Council's November meeting, which included the enforcement agencies, and there was general agreement on it, that it would be this rather than 72 hours, for instance. They didn't want it to go through another night and close at 8 in the morning. It was preferable to close at 1800 on the 3rd day.
Okay, no
Thank
further
you. Then
questions?
could we look at proposal A3, please? So proposal A3 is one that we offer every year. There's always some minor change or two that we propose to the fishery regulations. We hope that over time the number of changes gets smaller as they improve. And this one has several that we've identified during the course of actually the last 2 years, because we did not approve this similar one at the last annual meeting. So I will simply note that they are there. The major change of these minor amendments is simply to reorganize the fishery regulations, the sections of the fishery regulations, to put them in a more logical and usable order. I will note that at our meeting with our agency representatives yesterday, we went through the entire text of the fishery regulations. We identified a couple smaller minor amendments to the minor amendments. And when we ask you to adopt this proposal, we will ask you to adopt it with modifications as identified during the meeting. And that would give us the latitude to include the changes that were recommended to us that made sense.
Any questions? Seeing none, proceed.
All right. Thank you, sir. If we could look at proposal A4 then, please. A4 is a relatively short. It is an revision to vessel clearances in IPHC regulatory area 4. So vessels fishing there are required to clear in and out with certain exceptions. The current exception in the regulations is if they have VMS, vessel monitoring system. And this change is to add to the list of exceptions with the use of either electronic monitoring or having an observer on board. And so we simply add that to the regulatory language. And I will note that we have had a dialogue with the National Marine Fisheries Service as well as the enforcement agencies in the region, and we have all agreed on the language in the proposal. So it simply adds a couple of other exemptions to requiring a clearance for fishing in regulatory area 4. And that means 4A, B, C, D, and E.
Okay. Question, Mr. DeGrief.
Yeah, so is the requirement presently that they would have to hail in and hail out at the end of every trip? Like, or is it clear, similar to how we do it, or is it something different? Just curious.
Through the chair, Commissioner DeGrief, it's not quite the same as hailing in and out. They obtain a clearance, and this section of the regs is actually very long. It's like a page and a half, and it gives detailed instructions about how they do it and where they do it and who they have to call. But it's basically a clearance, and the idea is to identify and know which vessels are fishing in that part of the ocean. So it's not quite the same as hail in, hail out.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could we look at proposal A5 then, please? Proposal A5, we're bringing back to you from 2 years ago. And our proposal is that we eliminate the IPHC closed area. In other words, no longer close it. And the reason being is that the only sector that it is closed to presently is the directed Pacific halibut fishery. And we see no scientific reason to keep the directed fishery out of that part of the ocean any longer, and recommend that it no longer be closed. We recognize, of course, that includes, or it entrains a long series of management questions about who might fish in that area if it were open to the directed fishery, and how that might be managed. And that's not addressed here. We're simply suggesting that it no longer be closed to the directed fishery. So there's a number of ways that you might deal with that. The text of the proposal itself is quite short. It says take it out of the regs. The discussion here in the paper is relatively short. It cites previous studies that basically have observed over the decades that the closed area is no longer necessary in terms of protection or conservation of the stock. And it refers to the proposal from 2 years ago, which also had extensive appendices on previous studies and other documentation about the closed area. So that's simply our proposal. As you from our discussion yesterday, we noted that there's no pressing need to open the closed area. It's simply an unnecessary part of the regulations, and that's why we wanted to remove it.
And we also discussed the complications that would arise from opening it in terms of domestic management and through things that the agency or the council would need, the North Pacific Council would need to do, and that lacking, unless they acted, if we acted to open the closed area, it would sort of be a moot action pending development of that management regime by the council. Just noting that, presaging where I'm probably going to land on this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's exactly correct.
Mr. DeGrief.
Yeah, are there any statements from industry on this? Again, lots there. I was curious if there was one.
Through the chair, Commissioner DeGrief, I believe there are no statements about the closed area, or if there, let me look real quickly, my notes. Yeah, that is correct, Commissioner DeGrief. We had no written stakeholder statements about the closed area.
Thank you.
Mr. Davis.
Just looking at the top of page 2, where RAB made a recommendation to examine alternative management regimes for the closed area. So one regime could be to eliminate it, but has the Secretariat explored other alternatives, or did RAB indicate what they meant by alternatives beyond elimination of the closure?
Thank you. Through the chair. The RAB over the last couple of years has had some reasonable discussions around the closed area, and it's usually centered around the commission requesting that the commission makes a recommendation to the council to prevent other forms of fishing within the closed area that interact with juvenile Pacific halibut. At that time, it's noted that's currently not necessarily within the full mandate of the commission, and you will see that in some of the text coming from the conference board and the processor advisory board later today, where they're also holding discussions and from what I've seen, making a suggestion along those same lines. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Alvarez.
Well, on this particular issue, this is the second year I think this has been on our agenda. Second time the staff has recommended this. I'm not sure, but I think that the year before there may have been some industry comments, but I can't recall that.
Through the chair, Commissioner Alverson, this is probably the fourth time we've suggested this. The last time was 2 years ago, and the reason it's here at this meeting is because 2 years ago you asked us to bring it back in 2 years, and that's why we're here.
So there may have been comments 2 years ago or 4 years ago.
Yes, sir.
We may ask you to bring this back in 10 years.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Mr. Ryall.
Yeah, thanks very much. One question and observation. The question, does the Secretariat have a view on the utility of the closed area if there were not other fisheries occurring in that area? Or is it just because other fisheries are occurring that they don't feel there's value? The observation is, I don't agree with the statement that I think Dr. Wilson just stated, that it's not within the authority of the IPHC to manage bycatch. I think the convention is very clear on that, and it's stated in there. I think where there's disagreement is between the parties on how or whether that should be applied. But in Canada's interpretation of that, it's very clear that there is authority allowed to manage bycatch.
Thanks. Through the chair, and maybe it's my sore throat, what I'd indicate that that it's not fully within the mandate, that there is a domestic component, but as you correctly point out, it's currently written in the convention that way. Regarding the Secretariat's opinion, there are a number of nursery areas that have been presented to you. I think Dr. Carpy presented a migration map as well with the various nursery areas that are currently identified up and down the coast. And this is certainly one of them. And so whether you're asking the Secretariat that one of those is more important than the other, at the moment we don't have that information, and that's partly why the text has been structured to suggest that at the moment, if the Commission has no intention of recommending that the area be closed to other gears, that it doesn't make sense to maintain the closure for the directed fleet. But the other flip side of that coin is that if the Commission were to recommend that the Council close that to other gears that interact with Pacific halibut, it would have a net benefit. It's just that that hasn't been communicated, that that's the Commission's intention at the moment. Thanks, Chair.
Further questions or comments? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. If we could have proposal B1, which is the first of the proposals from the contracting parties, and this is from NOAA Fisheries, the Alaska region. And I'll ask Mr. Merrill to come up and speak to that proposal and take any questions that you might have. I introduced the proposal to you yesterday or the day before and briefly described how and why it's here for your consideration. Mr. Merrill can explain how it got here and then answer any questions that you might have about it.
Thank you, Commissioners. Just very briefly, this is, I believe, the sixth time that you have seen this particular regulatory proposal. Under domestic regulations, there are provisions for the catch sharing plan that we've established for our charter fisheries in areas 2C and 3A. Under those provisions, there is the ability for us to set on an annual limit various measures that would apply to those charter fisheries. And those are dependent upon the TCEY that is set for each of those areas. So under the catch sharing plan, we attempt to maintain the specific harvest by charter fisheries within the allocations as determined by those regulations. Each year, there is a charter management committee that meets. They make recommendations on the specific management measures that they believe will maintain the charter fleet to its allocation in each of those areas. The regulation or the regulatory proposal that you have before you here describes a range of different measures that would apply at different levels of catch limits for the charter fleet. Again, because this is going to be highly dependent upon the specific TCEY selected by the Commission at this meeting, then I don't know necessarily that it's a value for us to go through the specific measures that would apply under each of those proposals.
Through the chair, thank you, Mr. Merrill. I will note that as Mr. Merrill has described, the language of the proposal includes all the formulaic elements of choosing the management measures that are dependent upon what the allocation is. The allocation is derived from the catch sharing plan, which in turn takes the FCEY that's derived from your TCEY. So it's a bit of a cascade to get there, but we end up with a number and we enter the list at the number, and that determines the charter management measures that would be going into regulations. So when you mechanically, when you adopt this proposal, you adopt the proposal which says that. So it says that whatever the allocation turns out to be, those are the management measures that we'll put into the regulations.
And so we could approve this today prior to the approval of our catch limits because of its formulaic nature, correct?
Mr. Chairman, that is exactly correct. You could prove this one this afternoon. We're just asking to wait until you've heard from your advisory bodies, but but yes, you could, because it is formulaic. You simply approve it, and then tomorrow morning we'll tell you in conjunction with agency partners what the answer turns out to be.
Another fill in the blank.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Okay, now I don't see any questions. Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you, Mr. Merrill. And I'll ask Mr. Lockhart to come up and talk about proposal B2. So B2 has to do with the delineation of subarea 2A1 in IPHC regulatory area 2A.
This is a very straightforward proposal. The background in the document describes it well. There was a March 5, 2018 court decision that changed the western boundaries of the Quileute and the Quinault Indian Nation. And this change is only to make the definition in IPHC regulations consistent with that court decision. And all of it is very straightforward. It is actually important because it will allow us to make changes in a couple of other places in federal regulations. So we would appreciate adoption. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lockhart. Are there any questions? Seeing none, we can proceed forward.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. And likewise, of course, this is one that you could approve this afternoon. The remaining two proposals are stakeholder proposals. Neither proponent is here at the meeting, so I'll describe them for you. Both proposals have to do with recreational fisheries in the Alaska regulatory areas. The first one, proposal C1 here from Mr. Kearns, recommends common management measures across both the charter and the unguided sectors of the recreational fishery. It's you have to read through it, but it's in there, and it basically is the same bag limit to apply to all anglers in all recreational fisheries in Alaska. And then the second proposal, I'll just describe them together, is similar for Mr. Jarrett, again recommending common management measures for anglers across Alaska, although he does limit his suggestion to non-Alaska resident anglers in Alaska. But again, the common bag limit for them, whether they're fishing in the charter fishery or the unguided fishery. And in our implementation notes for you, the Secretariat recommends that you refer both of these proponents to the North Pacific Fishery Management Council because this is more properly a matter for their consideration.
Okay. I don't think there's any questions on this. Please move forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's all the regulatory proposals that we have before you. I will call your attention to paper 13, which is the Secretariat's implementation notes. And I've actually described our recommendations to you already on the contracting party proposals and the stakeholder proposals. And again, the stakeholder statements, revision 3, which was published from Sunday, and with many inputs, written inputs from the stakeholders for your consideration as you think about fishery management regulations, noting that the majority of them concern the charter recreational fishery and IPHC regulatory area 3A. And as we discussed yesterday, we will put it in the report, your request to us to make the stakeholder statements more useful to you in the future by organizing them and by topic area, providing a synopsis of what they tell you and inserting them at the appropriate points in the agenda so they appear in the right places for you.
Any clarifications, questions, any further information we need, Dr. Wilson or Mr. Keith?
I think not, sir. This is all we have to present to you. Certainly we and our agency partners are available for questions or consultation during the course of the day. And as we've said, we'll ask you to take action on these proposals this afternoon as far as you can go. And once you've heard the recommendations of the subsidiary bodies. I will note, just as a side, there's a few other things that you can do this afternoon if the time permits, one of which is to look at the meeting calendar for the next 3 years. That's on the agenda for tomorrow, but can be brought forward to this afternoon. And the one element there that we will ask your input on as from the United States side is your recommendation for where the annual meeting 2 years from now should be held.
Mr. Alverson.
So the timing of that, will that be moved back a week? Because this has been awkward.
Through the chair, Commissioner Halverson, yes, sir. Remaining future annual meetings are all scheduled in January, and we do not intend to ever schedule one in February again. And if necessary, we'll make it. And even if the North Pacific Council is in the last week of January, which was the case this year, we intend to propose that we meet the week before that. So that's our proposal to you. So the 3-year meeting calendar, which is in the document, has exactly that. The coming 3 annual meetings will be in January.
Do we know if they've already booked and scheduled their meeting? I see Mr. Wither on the back of the room. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, sir, we do actually from the 3-year meeting calendar on the North Pacific Fishery Management Council, and each case takes place after the dates of our annual meeting.
Okay, and so we can deal with that this afternoon. I don't know if there's any other business we could complete this morning. I'll just pause. So we will break very early for lunch, and we'll come back at 1:30, upon which time we'll receive our conference board and PAG reports, followed by revisitation of and action on some of the regulatory proposals, and perhaps the other item you just mentioned we'll take up. Dr. Wilson, did you have anything?
No, that's correct, Chair. Thank you. And we'll also revisit the fishery independent set line survey design after you've heard from the subsidiary bodies. But other than that, it's a clear agenda for the rest of the day. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, if there's nothing further, we're going to have a couple hours free time this morning, which I know we'll find ways to fill. And we will break until 1:30.